a joint resolution arising under the Congressional Review Act, HJ Res 30, disapproves of the Department of Labor's regulation that would allow and encourage investment managers and fiduciaries to prioritize so-called environmental, social, and governance factors, also known as ESG, in investment decisions, rather than focusing solely on maximizing the return for investors. Hardworking Americans and retirees of all income levels rely on institutional investment products like mutual funds and index funds to ensure that a comfortable and secure retirement at the end of their working days, and it is imperative that investment managers are not coerced into selecting lower performing investment vehicles at a pursuit of a dogmatic political ideology that is not centered on the best financial interests of their clients. I will now yield to our ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you very much. And now that Chairman Cole is here, I want to say your constituents are in our thoughts and our prayers following this weekend's tornadoes in Oklahoma. Before I begin, I want to recognize longtime Rules staffer Laurie Ismail, who is here, whose last day with the committee was Friday. And what? Yeah, that's why she's sitting out there and not here, right? Yeah. But many of you know Laurie well. Most recently, a senior professional staffer for the Rules team and for Rules Committee and our team's foreign policy advisor. She has been with the committee since 2016 and worked closely with the late Chairwoman Louise Slaughter. Born in Detroit and raised in Lebanon, Laurie has spent her career dedicated to public service. Before coming to the Hill, she worked as a legislative assistant at the White House Office of Legislative Affairs during the Obama administration. And her commitment to serving the American people continues in her new role, where she will work with Leader Jeffries' floor staff just down the hall. I speak for everyone when I say our loss is their gain. Laurie's sharp wit, her infectious positive attitude, and profound expertise will be a huge asset to their team. And so, Laurie, we're going to miss you, but we are so proud of you and excited to see what you have accomplish in your next step. So, and you will always have a home here in the Rules Committee. So, thank you. And with that said, we are here to consider two measures. First is H.R. 347, the Reduce Exacerbated Inflation Negatively Impacting the Nation Act, or REIN Act. And oh boy, is this one a doozy. My Republican friends have had months and months and months to write a plan on inflation, and this is it. This bill, and I hesitate to call it a bill because honestly, this is really just a tweet or a press release. I mean, this is the plan, more paperwork, a report. People don't need a report to know inflation is a global problem. And you don't need a PhD in economics to know a book report isn't going to solve it. Democrats took aggressive action on inflation. We capped insulin at $35 for senior citizens. That's real. Reduced prescription drug prices for seniors. Ensured Big Pharma faces penalties when they try to price gouge, and went after big oil for price gouging. All things that I should point out that House Republicans actively voted against over the last 2 years. We secured over $300 billion in investments in U.S. manufacturing to move supply chains back to America, fought to lower food and fuel prices, made the most robust updates in 70 years to the Buy American Act to boost domestic manufacturing, passed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act to cut costs for American families and bring down shipping costs, oversaw the largest one-year decrease in the federal deficit in American history. And that's what Democrats did. And it's not perfect, and inflation is still too high, and greedy corporations are still jacking up costs. But there's a difference here, a very important difference. Democrats fought to lower inflation, to hold those at the top accountable, and boost manufacturing to bring down inflation for good. And Republicans, I mean, their big plan to fight inflation after months of waiting, after all this big buildup, is a book report. Their solution is blame Democrats, blame Biden, and that's all this bill is about. It's not a serious plan. It's a press release. Our second bill today is H.J. Res 30. Last year, the Department of Labor clarified that environmental, social, and governance factors don't need to be treated differently when it comes to making investment decisions for retirement plans. Individuals submitted over 22,000 comments, and 97.4% supported the proposed rule. This is like using a hammer for surgery instead of a scalpel. And if my colleagues are so upset with this rule, might I suggest they bring actual legislation on this topic to the floor and not use a Congressional Review Act to hamstring future action by an agency. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield back my time.
Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses have will be included in the record. I'd like to welcome our first panel, Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Raskin to the witness table. Chairman Comer, I'd welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Cole, Mr. Burgess, Ranking Member McGovern. I urge the Rules Committee to grant a prompt and appropriate rule for the House's consideration of H.R. 347, the Reduce Exacerbated Inflation Negatively Impacting the Nation Act, or REIN Act. This legislation is timely and clearly needed. Sky-high inflation started sweeping across the nation soon after the Biden administration came into power. Pushing one big spending policy after another, President Biden has continued to throw fuel on the inflationary fire. The fire is rapidly consuming the wages of our constituents. They've had to pay higher and higher prices for everything from eggs to electricity, all while inflation pushes the real wages further and further behind. But President Biden just doesn't seem to get it. And apparently a few Democrats on here don't seem to get it or admit it. At first, he and his administration ignored warnings his policies would spark inflation. Then they tried to spin the tale that inflation was only temporary. Then when it became obvious to everyone that it was not the case, they attempted to claim that a monthly decrease in the rate of how fast inflation was rising meant inflation was actually falling. But anyone could see that made no sense. It's long past time the president learned and admitted more about his actions have led to this harmful inflation. That's why we need this bill. The REIN Act ensures that costly actions the president decides to take solely under his own authority through executive orders will not go into effect until he's informed of and considers the potential inflationary effects. Now, how does the bill require that? Simple. It requires the president receive and consider inflation estimates from the Office of Management and Budget and the Council of Economic Advisors for each executive order that is projected to cause an annual gross budgetary effect of at least $1 billion. The hope is the president, once he's informed of and understands the potential for inflationary harm from his own policy initiatives, will think twice about inflicting such harm. Here's hoping he does. In addition, the bill requires regular reports to Congress on these new inflation estimates that are prepared for and considered by the president. That way, if the president ignores the dangers and marches ahead with an inflation-inducing policy, Congress will be better equipped to take timely action to rein in an irresponsible use of presidential power. That is our constitutional role in the legislative branch, which the REIN Act recognizes. This powerful legislative medicine will, I hope, lead the president to stop his inflationary onslaught of this economy. Again, I ask the Rules Committee to grant a prompt and appropriate rule for the House's consideration of this legislation, and I welcome the committee's questions. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Cole. Thank you, Mr. McGovern. So after 2 years of rooting for economic failure and blaming President Biden for global inflation and global disruption of the supply chains, Republicans finally have the chance to take center stage now with their proposed solution to the problem of inflation. And the world has been waiting with bated breath for their answer to it. Would it be government wage and price controls like Richard Nixon gave us? Would it be the strict laissez-faire policies of Herbert Hoover that plunged the country into depression? Well, the long wait is over. Our friends have debuted their big plans with H.R. 347, something called the REIN Act, which stands for the Reduce Exacerbated Inflation Negatively Impacting the Nation Act, a bill for a mandatory reporting requirement related to executive orders. You've heard that right, a reporting requirement related to executive orders. And so whether you think this is the most brilliant legislation since Social Security or the dumbest idea since the last $1 trillion giveaway in taxes, you must concede that it will have little or zero effect on the global inflation rate or the domestic inflation rate. And I know our friends are invested in incomprehensible acronyms in the 118th Congress, so I want to suggest a much better fit for the title, which would be the Running on Empty Initiative Based on No Ideas, None Act. This legislation was hatched without a hearing, and it shows it's devoid of any serious legislative meaning or potential economic consequence. And even as reporting bills goes, it's pathetically weak, as it doesn't even require publication of the report. And I don't know if that was an oversight or not. But look, the bottom line is executive orders are plainly not the cause of inflation, and there is no economic research suggesting that they are. The most conservative economists in the world will tell you that inflation is a complex global phenomenon connected to prices, supply chains, supply and demand curves, and the unemployment rate. Since 2020, inflation has risen worldwide, exacerbated by supply chain delays caused by the coronavirus pandemic, and then Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine, which disrupted energy markets everywhere on earth. Biden has created something like an economic miracle out of the chaos handed to him by Donald Trump. After signing a massive tax giveaway to the wealthy and large corporations in 2018, Trump's dysfunctional response to COVID plunged America into its most severe economic contraction since 1946. Under Trump, the unemployment rate rose to 14.8%, the highest on record since the Bureau of Labor Statistics began collecting data. In 2021, Biden and the Democrats got to work and passed the American Rescue Plan, which fueled a strong, equitable economic recovery with historic reductions in unemployment, poverty, and economic hardship. Real GDP increased by 5.7% that year, substantially surpassing pre-ARP forecasts by the Fed. By January 2022, the unemployment rate had decreased to 4%, again, surpassing pre-ARP forecasts. Wages increased by 5%, so 5.7% from the prior year, with the highest increases going to the lowest wage workers. Democratic policies have allowed the U.S. to absorb the shock of rising inflation engulfing the globe since 2020, a phenomenon that economists attribute to coronavirus supply chain disruptions and Russia's bloody war of aggression in Ukraine. During this time, dramatically increased federal spending, both by executive order and by law, began under President Donald Trump. According to Moody's Analytics, Democratic economic policies helped prevent the U.S. economy from slipping into a double-digit recession in spring of 2021, and recent figures show that the annual inflation rate is now lower in the U.S. than it is in the UK, in Canada, and all 20 European Union member states. Our fight against inflation has been waged aggressively on many fronts. Biden led an historic infrastructure bill for all of our districts and the CHIPS and Science Act, which are now at work creating more jobs all over the country, training more workers in high-demand skills, and rebuilding the domestic manufacturing sector. Democrats passed and signed into law Inflation Reduction Act to cut everyday health care and energy costs for working families while fighting climate change and cutting the deficit. The results have been dramatic. For example, the cost of insulin for diabetics in the Medicare program has been cut to $35 a month. We've also systematically cut shipping costs and are working at everyday unfair corporate fees to eliminate those imposed on consumers. Bottom line, the Democratic policies of the last 2 years have ushered in a record 12 million new jobs, including 800,000 manufacturing jobs to alleviate our reliance on global supply chains and build the clean energy economy. We've also enacted the largest deficit reduction in history, totaling $1.7 trillion to date. This agenda of strong action by Democrats is working, with employment soaring and inflation falling for the last 6 straight months. When pressed to identify specific executive orders that warrant passage of this executive order reporting bill, our friends will point to President Biden's revocation of the Keystone XL pipeline permit on his first day in office and his executive order transitioning the federal automobile fleet to electric vehicles over the next decade. 2 essential steps in addressing the climate emergency bearing down on Americans all over the country. To blame these 2 executive orders for the broad global pressures that shape inflation, and to suggest that executive orders are central somehow to moving the needle on inflation in the $26 trillion economy of the United States is nothing short of comical. The running on empty initiative based on no ideas, none act is a confession that our friends have no plan and no strategy to fight inflation and cannot be bothered even to have a hearing to solicit practical ideals and practical ideas from real economists. So we recommend a no vote given the essential emptiness and inefficacy of the proposal, but whether you vote for it or not is of little public policy consequence because the legislation will have no real-world effect on inflation or deflation. To seriously address inflation requires the kind of coordinated and rigorous economic policy that the Biden administration is presently engaged in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and I don't have any questions. Before I do, I want to just quickly make a point. But we stopped inflation by stopping you guys from spending. It's the American Rescue Plan. I can quote Larry Summers, I can quote Jason Furman, I can quote Democratic economist after another. That was the culprit. This is the secondary thing, and I appreciate us moving to shut this door as well. And with that, I'll turn to my good friend, Dr. Burgess, for any questions he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate that. Obviously, to get a chance to talk about this a lot on the floor tomorrow, so it won't take up too much time. But, Mr. Comer, let me just ask you, does it feel like we're living in the middle of an economic miracle right now?
I was home in Kentucky for 2 weeks, and all I heard were people complaining, struggling from paycheck to paycheck. They may be making a little bit more money than they were last year, but it's been eaten up by inflation. The cost of groceries, cost of gasoline. And the people in my district believe, as I do, that it's a direct result of bad policies in the Biden administration, which this bill will hopefully address, and too much spending in Washington, D.C.
Well, some days I feel like I'm trapped in a Charles Dickens novel. It's the best of times, it's the worst of times. But I got to tell you, $3 a gallon gas in my district in North Texas in February probably means big trouble around Memorial Day as far as the price of gas. And constituents are feeling that,
Yes.
and they're sensitive to that. I'm glad the Keystone Pipeline was brought up. I felt like that was one of the single most boneheaded ideas that I've ever heard of, and it's been well documented through other work and other committees, the number of jobs that were immediately not just lost, but trashed because of that executive order. And maybe had there been some oversight at that point, we maybe would have come to a different conclusion. I also can't help but think of the immediate overturning of some of President Trump's efforts to control illegal immigration on the southern border. Affects my state in a big way. But these things have had a profound effect on the economy of certainly my state and our country. So I think this legislation is timely. I think it's necessary, and look forward to talking about it a little bit more on the floor tomorrow, but I thank both our witnesses for being here today.
Distinguished ranking members recognized for whatever questions he cares.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent to insert on the record a statement from Representative Sheila Jackson Lee in support of her 5 amendments to H.R. 347 that aim to address the ambiguity and unnecessary oversight of presidential executive orders this bill unfortunately puts forward. So
Without objection.
yeah, I don't have any questions. I mean, I think I would expect something like this maybe to be an amendment to a bill that actually does something, but this is a book report. And if this is my friend's answer to dealing with inflation, then, boy, I'll tell you, I expected something a little bit more original, something more substantive, but this is what you offer the American people, then we should, debate it on the floor, and people can make their own minds up about how they want to vote. I mean, but after all the buildup, after all the time, the months and months and months about saying, we're going to do something about inflation, this is it, it's a little bit underwhelming. But anyway, it's good to see you both, and I will yield back my time. I have nothing else to say.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Comer, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I mean, yeah, my first thought was, with all due respect to my friend from Massachusetts, they passed a bill titled the Inflation Reduction Act that I think by all accounts, everyone would agree just about significantly increased inflation. It didn't reduce inflation. So I don't think the solution to reducing inflation is passing a bill to spend more money. I think it's to try to rein in spending and to rein in unnecessary regulations. And we've got to put a price tag on some of these executive orders. You mentioned the border, Dr. Burgess. One of the things we want to do in the Oversight Committee, I met with an Inspector General today, is to put a price tag on this. What is this costing the taxpayer in transportation costs, in housing, in Medicaid, in public education, in food stamps? I mean, this is a significant cost to the American taxpayer. Where does this money come from? It's inflationary spending, and we've got to get spending under control, and we believe that a lot of the inflation is a direct result of bad policies that this president's done through executive order, like canceling the Keystone Pipeline and the student loan debt and things like that.
Yeah, let's not forget, before that bill was passed, we were told that it had nothing to do with climate change. It was just about inflation. The second that bill passed, it was glorified as the biggest bill on climate change that had ever been passed. So it's amazing how quickly the narrative shifted. And I still don't understand how it did anything for climate change if it did nothing to address the number one polluter, and that's China. Again, if you add up the carbon, we're the only nation that signed on to the Paris Climate Accord that actually reduced our emissions. And we did it because we had clean natural gas from places like Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio. But in Texas, of course, and Oklahoma, let's not forget, of course. But if you add up China's CO2 emissions, they're more than the United States, the entire EU, and Japan combined. And that act did zero to address the CO2 emissions from China, yet it was purported to be this big climate change bill. And again, it did nothing to address inflation. Arguably, it made inflation worse. But with that, I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do share my colleagues' frustration that after months of hearing complaints about inflation, now that our colleagues are in charge of the House, it turns out they have no plan to actually address inflation. Instead, we're seeing valuable legislative time and taxpayer dollars used to pass a bill that requires more paperwork, which I think we could all agree we have enough paperwork in D.C. We don't see a plan to lead on this issue, only to criticize what's been done in the past. If anything, it's reminiscent of the Republican health care plans that, more than a decade after passage of the Affordable Care Act, we're still waiting to find what the solution is to be there. So, we've seen the Democrats take action. Inflation, yes, is too high, but it is down. Gas prices are down by at least a third from their peak. The cost of goods are down. Consumer spending is strong. And employment is at the lowest mark it's been in half a century. So the U.S. has come out of the pandemic with astonishing strength, although there's still much more work to be done. And I would rather be doing that work than passing yet another messaging bill that is not actually going to tackle the problem. So with that, I would yield back.
Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And, I kind of want to say as I'm sitting here, this is common sense. This is, as we try to get the fiscal house in order, this makes sense. And it makes sense to control something where money is being spent with no hearing, no transparency, nothing, just being spent without any kind of accountability. And so I don't have any questions, just that I appreciate this because it really is trying to get things under control and have some understanding of what's happening, some reporting, and some limits makes good sense. And I think that the American people would see that too. And I think it's, and I wasn't even going to mention it, but I do think it's laughable that the Democrats are saying this is our only response to inflation. There's a lot we've got to do, and we all know it. And this is one of the things that is part of that plan. And so I appreciate you coming here, Chair Comer, and we'll be happy to support this because I think it makes sense.
Is that the right one, or is it for that one? I don't know. I'm going to use yours. I'll steal it. All right, that works. All right, sorry about that. Well, good evening. Good to be back with our colleagues. Long 2 weeks, Mr. Roy. Getting used to it. Good to be back with our colleagues, and good to see you, Mr. Chairman, and our ranking member, of course. And we continue to keep our ranking member in our prayers, and good to see my friend here testifying in front of the committee. I was struck by something you said, Mr. Comer, in terms of the last couple of weeks being back home, talking to your constituents. And I was doing a little research about your district. I've never been to Kentucky, so I was reading more about Henderson and Frankfort, some of the communities that you represent. And it sounds like the concerns that you're hearing back home are similar to the concerns I've been hearing in Colorado about inflation, about the price of eggs. I don't know if did that come up at all in your conversations with folks back home?
Lots of things.
Rents, are difficult right now. Clearly a challenge that we're all facing collectively and that we need to address as a country. What I'm struck by is we're home for a couple weeks, visiting with our constituents. We hear these concerns. We return, and the bill we're considering, and I recognize it's not your bill, you've co-sponsored it, but the bill from Ms. Stefanik requires the President, the White House, to put together a statement on executive orders that the White House issues, send that to Congress, and nothing more. I mean, Mr. Fischbach used the words, I think, reporting and limits. Undoubtedly, this bill, which, as Mr. McGovern said, is about as short as some amendments that I've seen from Mr. Massey and others, but it certainly provides for reporting. But there are no limits. Let's not kid ourselves here. This bill doesn't impose any limits. And I guess what I'm struck by is why not put a bill on the floor, Mr. Chairman, that actually addresses inflation as opposed to as Mr. McGovern said, which I thought was a pretty astute observation, a book report. I mean, I don't get it. I'm trying to understand how this satisfies your constituents.
I don't think you understand the damage that this administration's policies have created with respect to inflation.
Is this retroactive?
Yeah, absolutely.
I didn't realize that.
You see on the news when he says, I'm going to eliminate
Could
student
you take a
loan
step
debt.
back?
I'm going to
Just clarify that for me.
Pipeline.
You said absolutely.
We
Mr.
play a
Chairman.
role in this business here.
No, I hear you, but I want to make sure I'm not, because it sounds like your staff might want to correct that. This isn't retroactive. You're not imposing.
It does not apply.
It doesn't apply to
Right,
any executive orders that
retroactive.
have been
No,
issued.
right,
So this
right,
is perspective. This is saying, look, to the people of Frankfurt, I know you're dealing with high prices of eggs, and my answer to that is that the OMB is going to put together a paragraph as to whether or not they believe that an executive order is going to increase inflation or decrease inflation. And by the way, even if it increases inflation, it's not going to change that order being issued. I mean, I guess that's why I'm struck, is why not put something with teeth?
This is for a price tag of over $1 billion. And I know a little bit about eggs. I'm a farmer, and I was Commissioner of Agriculture before I came here. But there are a lot of things that are creating hardship on Americans. Everything, just about at the grocery store, has seen significant inflationary pressure. So we've got an administration that I don't think is aware of the price tag of some of the policies that they are implementing through executive order. And we're trying to do everything in our ability to rein in this administration to help try to put a price tag on.
By requiring them to publish a few sentences? That's reining in. I understand you keep using the word reining in. I understand it's a fun acronym for the bill. But I guess what I'm saying is, I know my colleagues, we have fundamental disagreements with Mr. Massey and Mr. Roy from time to time, but I know they've got a bevy of bills that they believe would reduce inflation, that would have some real teeth that they could put on the floor. And I'm struck by why we're considering this reporting measure after having been home for the better part of the last 2.5 weeks visiting with our constituents about the real challenge of inflation, that this is the solution. Now, I'll give you an example of something we could be doing. A year ago, there was a bill called the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. Do you remember that bill, Mr. Chairman?
Not right
off. It's a bipartisan bill that was passed by the Senate and by the House to reduce shipping costs, to help ranchers and farmers in Colorado and in Kentucky and elsewhere get their products out to market, export them across the world. That bill passed with bipartisan support. Majority of the Republicans in this room voted against it, but the chairman, then ranking member, Mr. Cole, voted for it. Mr. Reschenthaler voted for it. Ms. Fischbach voted for it. I was proud to join them in voting in favor of that legislation. You, Mr. Chairman, did not. That's an example of the kind of bipartisan legislation that we put on the floor during the course of the 117th Congress. And boy, would it be refreshing if we could take a similar approach. We outstretch our hands. If there's some bills that could really make a difference in curbing inflation, I'm all ears. But one-page reporting bills, I just don't think cut it. With that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Something interesting has happened with our debt here recently that hasn't happened in history, really. We got to about $26 trillion by borrowing money. And then most recently, when COVID hit and the first $2 trillion package came to the floor, there weren't $2 trillion to borrow. It didn't exist in circulation. So what happened? How did we finance that debt? How do we finance that $2 trillion and the next $2 trillion and the next $1 trillion? In fact, we financed $5 trillion of this debt by printing money. The Federal Reserve printed the money, and then the Treasury borrowed it from the Federal Reserve. So we kind of borrowed it from ourselves, but what came into existence was $5 trillion that did not exist before. Now, had we borrowed it, we would have taken it out of the economy, and then when the money was put back into the economy through various programs that were supposed to help businesses, and may or may not have had their intended effect, if we had borrowed the money and put the money back in, we wouldn't have increased the money in circulation. But what we did over the last 3 years is increase by $5 trillion the amount of money that's in circulation before the banks loaned it out fractionally. Mr. Raskin, do you think that creating new money and putting it into the economy had any effect on inflation?
But I assume it does, but I've not looked at the studies about that. I mean, you're talking about the QE2 lending program that the Fed set up with Treasury?
This is since QE2.
Yeah.
This was specifically for COVID. The Federal Reserve created $5 trillion. If you look at their graph, it's kind of flat for since 1917.
Yeah.
Their balance sheet. Then it went up $5 trillion right there at the. And so what that means is $5 trillion came from somewhere. What happened is they printed the money and then loaned it to Treasury. Then Treasury, well, we spent the money. I don't want to blame Treasury. Congress appropriated this money, and it went out the door, and then that went into people's hands, and they started buying stuff.
Right. No, I mean, that's a serious question, and certainly there are fiscal stimulus sources of inflation, and there are, and there are Fed sources of inflation as well. But they're not executive order sources of inflation. I mean, no economists have ever identified that. So, but that's a serious question, and of course,
Chip,
that goes.
your tea?
I mean, that goes way beyond the purview of this legislation.
So this is Chip Roy's tea. He doesn't need it anymore, I've decided. This is what happens when you have a quantity of something, and then you add more to it. This is dilution. The principle is so simple that a child can understand. And you can create this little science project at home. Sorry, you can have your tea back. Okay. But the principle is called dilution. And when you print $5 trillion and you put it into the economy, you have diluted the value of the money. So for instance, if you had a minimum wage at some amount, and somebody was making minimum wage, and they were still making minimum wage after this money was printed, they actually are making considerably less in terms of real dollars. It's dilution. So the $5 trillion that we printed, I would argue, is the primary source of inflation. You know, we can say, well, eggs went up because feed went up, fuel went up because there's a war in Ukraine. You can find a lot of excuses for various different industries. But what is the probability that every price went up all at the same time? You can't blame them on specific supply chain problems. The thing
How do you explain the global?
Yes, I'm glad you asked me that, Professor Raskin. Because they did the same thing in Europe. They did this everywhere. They printed their own equivalents of the Federal Reserve and Treasuries, created their own money out of thin air. It may be the only thing that saved our dollar is that everybody else did the same thing to their currency. And so the question is, right now we're coming up on the debt limit. Why isn't anybody proposing to print more money? Why aren't the economists proposing to print more money? Because it is poison. When you print money, it is poison to our economy, and it is very regressive. Inflation is extremely regressive, especially when it affects the goods that everybody needs to buy. Energy. I love it when they print the consumer price index, neglecting food and energy and housing, right? Like the three things that no matter how poor you are, you still need. We'll just leave those out when we look at the effect of inflation, but you can't leave those things out. So the reason we're not, we could just print more money again like we did over the last 3 years, but the reality is everybody in this room knows, and if we don't, we have staff who know, that if you print money, you're going to wreck this economy. So I found it interesting that the Fed raised interest rates very aggressively over the last several quarters, the last year. Do you have any idea, Mr. Raskin, why they would raise interest rates?
I really don't. I've not followed it that closely. I mean, your line of questioning to me is interesting because I think it goes to what the real sources of inflation are in the economy and what the money supply is and so on. Remember that the various actions taken that you identified were in response to a crisis, which was COVID-19 and an economic collapse in the country, and everybody on a bipartisan basis, with perhaps the potential exception of you, was demanding that the federal government act in order to bolster the economy because the restaurants were going down and the hotels were going down and our businesses were collapsing. And so, we make no apologies for any of the rescue legislation that we did, and we think we did the right thing, even if that was, some small contributor to the overall global inflation that we saw. And I will say that, of course, this has been a bipartisan policy commitment. And under President Trump, we know that your side of the aisle voted 3 times to lift the debt limit as requested by President Trump. And President Trump's own spending contributed 25% of the total debt of the United States from George Washington to Joe Biden. 25% of it. So this is a bipartisan problem that we got to deal with.
I like those numbers where we look at which administration was in power when the debt went up and what percent, maybe 25% under Trump. The reality is we are the ones who raised the debt limit, not the president. So I went back and looked to see under which speaker did the debt limit go, or did the debt go up the most. And it turns out somewhere between 43 and 45% of all the debt, you mentioned that 25% of all the debt was under Trump. Using those same metrics, 43 to 45% of all the debt ever incurred in this country happened while Ms. Pelosi was Speaker. Now, she had a good run at it. She had 2 chances to do it. She was Speaker twice. But, so I think it's unfair to blame any one administration. I think it's more fair to blame us. And in reality, because we're the ones who raised it. Now, the problem with the stimulus that we did during COVID, yes, there was an economic calamity and people stayed home, but when you gave farmers money, when you gave people money, the farmers didn't make more goods, the factories didn't make more goods, the refineries didn't refine more oil. Demand for fuel went down, so we saw a temporary, if you look at inflation, it actually went down there for a while nobody was doing much of anything. But after we put that money in their hands, now they're chasing goods that don't exist. They literally buying the inventory because so many things were shut down. Let me ask you, Mr. Comer, the same question I asked Mr. Raskin about interest rates and why the Federal Reserve might have raised the interest rates so aggressively. Do you have any idea of what they might have been trying to do when they raised those interest rates?
They're trying to slow inflation. You raise interest rates for one reason, and that's to slow inflation. Yep. So the 2 ways that most economists would agree you reduce inflation is you raise interest rates and you reduce government spending.
So, and that's exactly what they did. Now, I found it interesting. Now that we have established that, and we all know that, they raised, nobody would want to raise interest rates. Low interest rates, people can borrow money, you can buy housing, the price of housing, people can afford housing more, investors, entrepreneurs can get money more easily, and your economy grows faster with lower interest rates. So they would prefer to have them low, but they had to raise them, they felt, to combat inflation. Now, what I found interesting was the timing. Mr. Raskin, why do you think they really aggressively raised interest rates just a week or two after the Inflation Reduction Act passed? I mean, the Federal Reserve raised interest. I thought it was kind of interesting that they would do it since we already had an Inflation Reduction Act and it had been signed by the president. Why would they take action to do that?
Well, I take it everybody was calling for action on inflation, so it required a kind of coordinated response, and the Fed acting in the same direction as Congress makes sense.
Maybe Senator Joe Manchin reduced the confidence at the Federal Reserve that the Inflation Reduction Act was going to do much of anything when he said it wouldn't do much of anything. And I think that's what we all know. It was a climate change bill, and it wasn't really about reducing inflation.
Well, if I could say one thing on that.
Yes, please.
It certainly reduced the cost of prescription drugs for people in the Medicare program and reduced the cost of diabetics getting their insulin shots. So that affects millions and millions of our constituents across the country. That was inflation too.
So here's the interesting thing. The arsonists became the firefighters at the Federal Reserve. If you remember where I began, $5 trillion was created by the Federal Reserve. And then, which we said, thank you very much, we'll take those 5 trillion new imaginary dollars that spend just like real dollars, and we'll, actually we didn't put a lot of that money into the hands of consumers. They got maybe 12% of it, 20% if you count the unemployment programs. Most of it went to big companies. But, so then we took the $5 trillion the Federal Reserve created and caused massive inflation with the Federal Reserve printing that money. Now who's here to save the day? The Federal Reserve comes in on a white horse. Oh, look at this fire, this raging fire called inflation. We're going to put it out. We've got just the tool. We're going to hose down the economy. This thing is too hot. Well, the reality is it wasn't too hot. Inflation was too hot. Sometimes you raise interest rates when, if your economy is doing great, it can be a tool, a reasonable tool to reduce inflation. The problem is when your inflation's raging and your economy is not, and you raise interest rates, you just make life difficult on everybody, on people trying to buy homes, on businesses who are trying to invest and expand production to meet the new demand of the new money that's out there. So anyways, I just hope everybody recognizes that the firefighters, i.e. the Fed, are the arsonists who started this problem by creating $5 trillion out of thin air. And here's what else is going to happen. We haven't even begun to see inflation, like what the result of all that will be. That's why I think this bill is important. We shouldn't be doing things that exacerbate this track that we are already on. Mark my words. I know a lot of people don't come to Rules Committee to look for predictions, but I'm going to make a prediction. This is the tip of the iceberg, the inflation that we are seeing, because we have to refinance that $32 trillion of debt that we have right now. And, the interest rates, the Fed raised the interest rates about 2.5%. So now, some of the debt we have at the $32 trillion, we have short-term debt, and it'll have to be refinanced quickly. Some of it already has been refinanced at these higher rates. Some of it's much longer, 10 years. But if you refinanced $32 trillion at 2.5% higher interest rates, that's $800 billion of additional interest. Here's what makes me so concerned. How are we going to finance the additional $800 billion of interest? Are we going to raise taxes? I don't think we are. I think we're going.
Gentleman, you?
In just a second, I think we're going to print more money. And what's that going to do? It's going to raise inflation. And what will the Fed do to try to control inflation? They will raise interest rates. What's going to happen then? We're going to have higher interest on our own debt. We're going to print more money. I think we're at the beginning of a vicious cycle that's not going to calm down for a while. And I'll yield to Mr. Neguse.
Yeah, I would just simply say I think you see a lot of heads nodding. I think it's a fascinating discussion, and I've certainly learned a lot. And I guess I wonder why we can't take up a bill regarding the Fed's decision-making as opposed to this reporting bill about executive orders that has nothing to do with any of what you
Thank you.
described.
I have a few of those bills, and I would love I have some Democrats
link
on
up.
this bill, actually. Would love your co-sponsorship on an audit of the Federal Reserve.
Let's vote this bill down. Let's get back down to doing, considering some of these other measures that might have a real impact.
All right.
I yield back.
Reclaiming my time. I thank you very much. I think this is a good bill. The only concern that I have about it, and this gets to, the base bill itself has some exemptions for if there's an emergency or national security. It's got exemptions. Let's don't consider how much inflation we might be causing in our response to this emergency or to this national security issue. I think we shouldn't care what the reason is we're spending the money. We should always know what the consequences are to inflation. So I have just a small issue with the base bill, but it's also an issue I have with most of the Democrat amendments to this bill. They create exemptions where you won't even want to measure what the inflation is that's caused by it. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, my colleague, Mr. Roy, probably has an amendment to get rid of all of the exemptions for when you wouldn't want to know when you're causing inflation. So before I yield back, I just want to say that I support Mr. Roy's amendment, and eggs are up 70%, butter's up 32%, airline fares are up 25%, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for questions.
Thank you so much, Chairman, for recognizing it. And Chairman Comer, thank you. It's good to see you again. You know, I always like talking rural issues, as you know, because that's New Mexico and that's Kentucky, where you're at, right? And but before I get to that, I just do want to note that there is, I am concerned that before I get to anything about the merits of the bill, and hopefully we'll look at this, is that the manner in which tribes have been referenced here is not quite accurate, that tribes should not be considered within a state because they sit separately from states. And usually in our legislation, we try to have a separate reference for tribes, states, tribes, local governments. So I think we could probably all agree that would just be a technical fix to this. And I have an amendment that we've submitted regarding that. But back to the rural nature of what's happening. So there are many things that are up. One of the things that is definitely up are corporate profits, right? And this is one of those areas that we know we need to address, because one of the areas that's really out of control is the fact that our farmers and ranchers are limited. There's not enough competition within the slaughterhouses.
I agree.
Right? We agree on that. And that leads to that leads to inflation. That has been very inflationary. And the ones benefiting are not the ranchers and the farmers. And so we have bills that would look at that. And so I think that's the approach that I like to see, is where we actually take specific action to address the inflation. Like, where is it coming from now, right? We know the pandemic was big and hard. The bill that was passed into law was important with regards to shipping, because that made a difference. The bills that we passed where we reduced the cost of insulin were very important, because that means that that's reducing costs that our families are having to pay. And those are the things that I am very proud of what we did with regards to not just passing a bill that might have a report, paperwork versus action. And I like the fact that we were taking very specific action in last Congress, reducing costs that families have to pay, whether that be the many bills that we did. The Inflation Reduction Act actually addressed many of the causes of inflation when it's looking at manufacturing here. Cheaper insulin, reducing food costs. I mean, those are things that we voted on, and that we didn't get very many Republican votes on. But actually, we didn't get any Republican votes on. But those are the kinds of things that are direct action that I would look forward to us taking, and versus a bill. Well, it's nice in that it's short. I'm not sure that it actually accomplishes much. So with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Comer, this is just another measuring technique, isn't it? To be honest with you, about what inflation is doing to the country.
That what now? I'm sorry.
This is just this bill is just a measuring technique, correct?
Yeah, we want to try to get a price tag on what these policies are.
Of what's happening. And wouldn't you think our friends on the other aisle would be for measuring?
I would think that.
Because, let me just read some quotes from President Biden on July of 2021. As our economy comes roaring back, we've seen some price increases. And Biden said, while rejecting concerns that the recent increases could be a sign of persistent inflation. Ms. Pelosi made the comment, inflation is an issue, but it's global. What's Republicans' plan? Inflation is there, but it's global and not as bad as it seems. President Biden on July 20 of 21, our experts believe, and the data shows that most of the price increases we've seen are expected to be temporary. All the while, and Congressman Massey went over some things, you go down the list from eggs to oil to gas, everything. I'm in the construction world. I can't tell you the projects that have been canceled because you either can't get supplies, the oil and the natural gas is skyrocketed. Evidently, this president likes buying oil from foreign countries of OPEC that don't like us. Mm-hmm. And you talk about what would be, and if you use unless these numbers lie, inflation has risen 14.3% since the Biden administration took over. And what would be refreshing, you would think that at the State of the Union, he would have you're talking about solutions, that he would lay out a vision for America that would get this economy back roaring as he says it is. Prices would come down. Yet, anybody that listened to the State of the Union, he talks about waitresses having non-compete agreements. He talks about luggage in airports going up. Is that not the dumbest explanation of a vision? If he managed the Atlantic Ocean, the guy would run out of water. I mean, that's how serious this is. And evidently, the American people don't know what my friends on the other aisle say, that it's really good. We're spinning our way into prosperity. So I really have no questions. The numbers speak for themselves, and I appreciate you bringing this up. This ought to be, we ought to get a unanimous vote on this, because if the economy is that good, let's measure it, and let's see what the inflation is. If it's as good as they say it is, let's let the American people know. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, recognized for questions.
I thank the chairman. I would associate myself with the remarks of all my colleagues here, in particular the gentleman from Kentucky, in going through the impact of the printing of money and the spending of money over the last 5 years that very clearly drove up inflation. I'm always intrigued when I hear my colleagues throw out all of the responses and actions of government and Congress necessary to go clean up the mess of what Congress did previously and what the government did previously, and because that's what's being promulgated here. It's like, oh, we must do something. We must do something about the inflation that government created, right? So what should we do? I don't know, another program that probably spends more money. That would do it. That would douse the flames of inflation created by the great wisdom of the government. That's always seems to be the driving force. It's like, well, gosh, we just created this massive fire, and yeah, let's just throw some more gas on the fire by taking more action. Yet we put forward a bill. It's a simple 3-page bill. Look, don't worry. There's some more bills coming. There'll be some more conversations about spending a little later this year. We have lots of conversations ahead of us about spending. Conversations we should have about spending, about debt ceilings, about why we're continuing to borrow money we don't have to fund a government that's at direct war with the American people on a daily basis, undermining their ability to create opportunity and growth for their families, interfering with their freedoms every single day by bureaucrats in this town. We'll have plenty to say about that and plenty of legislative vehicles in which to go deal with those. Right now, what we're simply asking for is information. How many times, my colleagues, how many times do we reach out to bureaucrats in these agencies asking them to tell us something and they just shrug? I talked to an inspector general from one of the agencies just today, stonewalled over and over and over again in the agency in which this individual operates, unable to get facts, unable to get truth, unable to get answers to the very questions that individual wants to get in the very agency that individual is tasked with overseeing as the inspector general. So here we have a 3-page bill that really shouldn't be all that debated, but we've politicized everything. And we've got a 3-page bill to simply say, hey, if the president acts through an executive order, we would like to know whether there's an inflationary impact. That's it. That's what we're having this whole debate about. It's actually kind of funny, except that it's really important. Look, when President Trump was president, and he issued an executive order, or I don't even know if it's an executive order or a administrative action, but whatever, to have the emergency at the border declared and say, we're going to fund a wall with military funding. Well, I support a wall being built in Texas because we need to be able to deal with the border. I support a whole lot of other policies to deal with the crisis at the border. But I don't particularly love the use of emergencies to do that sort of thing. But I supported it. It was an emergency, but I think those things should be very short-lived and Congress should act. So I introduced the Article 1 Act with my friend Mike Lee over in the Senate to say, hey, maybe we should review the 40-odd plus emergencies we're still operating under that date back to the 1970s. Maybe all 435 members of Congress should care about Article 1 authority relative to Article 2 authority. Maybe we should actually do something about it. Maybe we should try to make them respond to us. So if we think policy making by executive order is a good thing down here in Article 2 land, I'm just going to disagree with that. I don't think we should allow the president to just unilaterally do stuff and we don't look at it and go, hey, what are you doing? Because, it's actually our job. And so for me, this is just another tool. I'm not a big fan of reports, right? But to get to the truth of trying to understand from the bureaucrats down the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue and scattered all over creation, okay, if there's an executive order, how much is that going to cost? What's that going to do from an inflationary standpoint? That is why I offered amendments not to exempt certain things. I don't like our defense hawks on either side of the aisle to go around saying, oh, but national security. Really? Right? There's no inflationary impact to what we're going to do for spending on national security, as if that should be exempted. Of course it shouldn't be exempted. We should make rational decisions about every dollar we spend. We should actually debate guns and butter. Heaven forbid we have a debate about guns and butter in this town and have, Econ 101 returned to the halls of Congress. But I am, what's that? You are for guns. That's true. We do know that. A couple of, interesting data points. We're talking about, inflation. And, I would just ask my friend from Kentucky, Mr. Comer, if he is familiar that, national health expenditures in this country went from about $3 trillion in 2010 to $4.3 trillion currently. Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Does it sound about right that, meanwhile, United Health grew about 172%, Cigna 653%, CVS Health 181% over the decade from 2010 to 2020, and I could go down the list of massive expansion of private healthcare entities. There's a gentleman I think is probably familiar because Humana I think has a footprint in Kentucky that Humana stopped servicing private insurance last week, announced that they were going to stop servicing employer-provided health insurance last week. Why? Because they're going to move their business entirely to government-sponsored health insurance. That's what's going on. You want to know what's driving inflation beyond simply the $5 trillion that was printed? Let's go back to some of the policy choices by this body to massively expand the government's role in a corporate crony state, to expand the government role in healthcare, driving up the price of healthcare in the name of coverage. Which, by the way, still praying for my friend from Maryland. My cancer, when I went to MD Anderson, and I had insurance then that I was allowed to go to MD Anderson in 2011. Under the Obamacare plan that I would get as a member of Congress, because despite the fact everybody says we're on some sort of, gold-plated plans exempt from, what the American people have, we're on an Obamacare plan. I couldn't get on MD Anderson. That's how great our coverage is. But you know what? I might be able to do something about that as a member of Congress. Really rich people certainly can do something about it. But the average person shoved into an Obamacare plan is screwed, unable to go to MD Anderson for the most part. So, look, what I'm saying is we've created government action, driven up the price of goods and services in healthcare. We've got government action driving up the price of energy on a regular basis. My friend from Maryland talked about climate change. Well, this is actually part of the problem. We act like we've got like a magic energy tree, right? Oh, we'll just go plug in our hybrids all over America, but where's the energy come from? It comes from somewhere. And so we go around saying, oh, let's pat ourselves on the back because we're constraining the ability of us to produce actual energy in the form of nuclear, gas, clean-burning American gas, coal even. While China has 1,100 coal-fired plants, we have about 250. They're building one a week. We're building none. We pat ourselves on the back that we're doing something for CO2 production. Meanwhile, China and India are just blowing the lid off the top. And so we're sitting around going, oh, look at us. Look how great we are, making electricity prices higher, making grids more unreliable, and people wonder why there's inflation. Of course there's inflation when you're constraining the ability of the market to go produce energy. Yeah, no, it's totally true. And the fact is, I'd yield to John.
Wait, gentlemen, the sidebar here was that I understand the policy disagreements about the various federal laws that we enacted over the last year. I guess what I'm trying to get at is the press release from Ms. Stefanik, the committee sheet from the rules staff here, the only executive order that is referenced is Keystone Pipeline. And of course, the majority is welcome to put a bill on the floor with respect to that particular issue. Is there another executive order in mind that you all are, that you claim had an inflationary impact, and so this bill is targeting? Because I guess I haven't.
And I'll take the climax. There are all sorts of, and look, I'll tell you what. I'll go.
Can you name one?
First of all, I'll research and come up with a list for you because I guarantee you there's a list. But let me tell you some examples.
Well, I mean,
but let me see examples.
That's what we're debating.
No, I'll tell you right now some examples.
Maybe Mr. Comer has one.
So we have the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. We have the efforts by the executive branch in terms of the moratorium on federal oil and gas leases and pause on leasing in AMWR, the overturn of the Trump executive action related to WOTUS and NEPA, the rejoin the disastrous Paris Climate Agreement, executive orders that directed the EPA, SEC, Interior, Energy to engage in rulemakings that restrict growth and drive up inflation. There's all sorts of ESG orders in the middle of the Labor Department, and those ESG orders are driving, through ERISA plans, are driving the crap up in the price of goods and services because they're more expensive. And those fees, by the way, are more expensive. What's that?
Clarifying, those are rules. I think we're taking up a bill in a moment regarding the rules that were promulgated by DOL. I don't think that would apply to this
My point is
bill.
that these actions, these rules, these executive orders by the executive branch ought to be looked at in full. And tell you what, if we want to offer an amendment that expands the zone to more administrative and executive action, I'm happy to do it, right? I want to know the damage being done by an executive branch that we're not overseeing. And so, look, if we want to expand that to understand the inflationary impact, I'd be happy to do that.
The gentleman,
make it bigger.
Yeah, I mean, just on that point, I mean, this is part of what I'm driving at is intellectually, I understand the argument you might make about an agency that promulgates a rule, and of course there are requirements within rulemaking for cost analysis and so forth. But that's the point that I'm making is that's very divorced from the executive orders that are being issued by the president. It doesn't seem like beyond again, I understand your objection with respect to Keystone Pipeline. Sure. Beyond that, I'm not hearing much in terms of executive orders being offered by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that would be subject to this bill in terms of an inflationary impact. But again, I won't belabor the point.
Well, my colleague here has a list and be happy to go through them. There are an enormous number of actions by the executive branch on a regular basis. There are executive orders that have inflationary impacts. That is, I think, on both sides of the aisle. And look, and by the way, I have zero partisan, decision making here from my end here in terms of believing that it should apply to one versus another. Again, that's why it's a little out of sync with this. But the Article 1 Act directed President Trump to limit those executive orders was on that basis, very specifically to do that. And in this case, we're simply just saying we'd like to know the inflationary impact.
Would the
I would
gentleman
yield to
yield?
the gentleman from Kentucky.
I just have a quick question for Mr. Comer or for Mr. Roy. I don't see Joe Biden's name mentioned in this bill. This would apply, we're going to have a presidential election, right? And if a Republican wins that election, a Republican who makes executive orders would have to comply with this bill as
Yes,
well.
sir.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Applies to both parties, whoever the President of the United States is.
So there doesn't seem to be any partisanship in this bill. So I'll yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the list that I rattled off there, all of those were initiated at one point through executive orders. Now, you can go back and kind of peel that onion back to say whether it's directly impacting or not. I'd certainly prefer it to be able to apply more broadly, to know whatever executive actions and rulemakings are being done. But there were executive orders that triggered most of those things that I just rattled off. That's my point. How it would directly apply, happy to debate, but that's the purpose. Those executive orders had direct impact on inflation.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Briefly. Would just say the CBO analysis that we received, maybe a different CBO analysis that Mr. Comer received, suggested that there will be about one executive order a year that would be subject to this bill. So, again, I'm not, so if you want to pursue amendments that would make this bill meaningful and substantive, I hear you. But I'm just, again, that's what the CBO gave to us.
Yeah,
Maybe I'm,
well, first of all, I could talk about the CBO for a while if you'd like, but we'll leave that aside. But I would also note that there are significant studies, for example, that would make very clear about the overall costs on these things, like the Committee for, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimated Biden's executive actions cost a total of $1.1 trillion, 23% of spending under his administration. My point is just simply, this is a serious problem. And look, if my colleagues on the side of the aisle think that it has very little impact and would produce a report on one executive order a year, okay, I'm not sure what the fuss is over. You should say, well, gosh, maybe we should just kind of sit back and let this roll. But my point is, this thing is actually about a much bigger problem, and I do believe the CBO is wrong. It will touch more.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'd yield.
I think Mr. Neguse may have been expressing support for your amendment,
Probably.
which lowers the threshold for this report to be created. Right now, there's $1 billion threshold, and you eliminate that or lower it to $100 million? Or?
Yeah, there's another amendment that would lower the threshold and expand it so there's no exemptions for national
would gentleman yield?
It's not my time, it's Mr.
Oh,
Roy's,
yep.
but I just found, before I give it back to Mr. Roy, I just find it interesting that you were concerned, it seemed, that there wouldn't be enough reports, but it seems as if Mr. Roy has the remedy for that. Now yield back to Mr. Roy.
Sure.
I'd yield to the gentleman.
Yeah, and I would just simply say I appreciate the invitation by Mr. Massey. I look forward to reviewing the language. My concern was how we're spending our time. We're spending our time discussing this bill as opposed to other more substantive bills. But I guess my concern would be to the extent you lower the limit, I don't know if that's going to drive up the cost of doing these analyses. So we're talking a lot about government spending, but this bill's going to have a price tag as well. The more that you lower the limit in terms of the executive orders.
Reclaiming my
Before
time,
the gentleman-
which is it? You want to be more effective or less effective? I'd yield to the chairman.
Just quickly, I'm concerned about time as well.
Yeah.
So I just remind you that we will be here for a long time.
Yeah.
We have votes going. The gentlemen are free to have as much discussion back and forth as they care to, but understand there'll be a consequence afterwards, so. Yield back to my friend from Texas.
Taking my time back, I appreciate that from the chairman. I've given that speech to my kids a lot, which, maybe says something here. But, look.
Gentlemen, I live all by myself and I go home alone, so I'm happy to be here all night and be entertained. And it's a great dialogue. Seriously, I mean that quite seriously.
Well, no, I appreciate that. And my family and my kids are in Texas, so when I'm here, it's just fair game. I can be here late too. But look, for our colleagues, I will yield back here. But I do think it's important here to understand the purpose of the bill. Again, we're talking about time and, we're wasting time. Well, then just voice vote it. I mean, look, at the end of the day, this is just simply a point that we're trying to make very clear to the American people about the significant amount of spending that goes on by the executive branch that has an inflationary impact. And I think the American people do know that, and also to make sure the American people understand that our response to every problem created by government isn't actually to put gas on that fire, but to figure out how we can constrain the actual problems caused by government action, which is, in fact, what the American people want us to do, to free them up to be able to solve these problems rather than have government solve these problems. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's no secret that Hoosiers need relief from this administration's harmful policies that have already added to our record inflation, which, as my colleagues have mentioned, has risen at least 14.3%, excuse me, since the president took office. We have, I just pulled a quick list, and I apologize for my, my quick notes on this. This is from a report from Biden's first 100 days in office, the executive orders that were passed. Keystone XL, student loan forgiveness, raising the minimum wage, allowing additional refugees, rescinding a ban on U.S. government funding for foreign nonprofits that perform abortions, directed the Attorney General not to renew federal contracts with private prisons, stops the U.S. withdrawal from the World Health Organization, rejoins the Paris Climate Accord, undoes the Trump's regulatory approval process. So those are just a handful. And it seems that my friends across the aisle, and I appreciate Mr. Negus's comments about the limits and where we are, but as we're debating this, and as Mr. Roy says, we're going to be considering other legislation, how could we, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Comer, how could we get a handle on inflation and begin to reduce the burden on American families without understanding the executive branch and their executive orders and their impact on inflation?
We have to understand. We have to do a better job in Washington. Inflation, in my opinion, has been driven by actions in Washington, both by Congress and the executive branch. I think Congress, with new leadership, led by many on this panel here, are going to play a role in trying to get a major, sincere role in trying to get spending under control. We also have to know what these executive orders are costing the government and the American people and how much they're leading to inflation. So I think this is a common sense bill, and I strongly encourage support for it.
So we can't honestly get a good handle on inflation, or even, we're going to have some legislation, I'm sure, this Congress to deal with this issue, but it's not magic money that comes out of the Biden administration or the executive branch. It's real money that belongs to the taxpayers that they're spending, and the public should have a right to know the impact on inflation of that spending. Don't you agree?
Absolutely, 100%.
Well, thank you. I'm proud to be co-sponsor of this legislation. I see this as a logical next first step in trying to get a handle on this. I appreciate the chairman bringing it. It's our job to hold the administration accountable for their spending as well as our own. We hold the purse strings. That's our responsibility. I appreciate the opportunity to support this legislation. Thank you.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Comer, for bringing this bill forward. You know, I listen to my colleagues here on the panel talk about how this doesn't address inflation. I don't know what districts that you spent your time in the last 2.5 weeks, but everywhere I went, whether it was a farm or a manufacturer or just a good old-fashioned town hall meeting, people want to throw the brakes on how to control federal spending. They are pointing to this capital is the reason that our inflation is off the charts. And they're looking for accountability in spending and someone to actually count the dollar bills. And that's exactly what I think that this legislation is doing is even if it's incremental, it is putting a price tag out there for the American people to see what, you know, all these feel-good executive orders that don't talk about numbers, that don't talk about, you know, the hole that we're digging our grandkids' right now, exactly what the price tag is. And the other thing I heard loud and clear in my travels across western New York and in the southern tier of New York in the last 2.5 weeks is people are tired of executive orders in general. And it's abuse by governors during COVID that, you know, finally these emergency powers are going away in most places. And thank God, finally the emergency powers hopefully will come to an end on May 11th here in the federal government with President Biden ending the emergency. But people are have had their wits' end with executive orders governing us, and they're calling on this body to do its job and to actually dictate the spending policies is much more eloquently laid out by Mr. Roy earlier. We have to get back to the work of the people. The one thing, Chairman Comer, there's some of the criticism of the REINS Act was that this is going to prevent President Biden from doing his job and issuing more executive orders. Is that the case?
No.
No. If this legislation doesn't prohibit the president from issuing executive orders, then why are our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, so intent on him, having unbridled, power and authority without checks and balances? We are here in divided government. We are here to do our jobs, and the REINS Act sends a loud and clear message to the American people that we mean business. So thank you, Mr. Comer, for coming in, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank our witnesses for your testimony. We miss you up here, my good friend, but I don't think you miss us probably too much.
I miss you guys a lot.
No, you miss the majority a lot, I think. The witnesses are excused. And I would welcome our second panel, Chairman Fox and Ranking Member Scott. Again, two of my favorite witnesses, and of course our former colleague, the chairwoman.